You see, when a man has nothing left but God, he enters a domain where worldly attachments lose their grasp and eternity becomes tangible. This isn't merely loneliness. This is sacred territory. It is the very place where the soul finds its true reliance, not on the validation of others, not on financial security, not on transient comforts, but solely on the presence of the living God. Some of the most profound individuals who ever walked this planet were people who spent time in the wilderness of isolation. Abraham journeyed away from all that was familiar to follow a voice he could not see. Joseph was betrayed, sold, incarcerated, and forsaken before his divine dream came to fruition. Elijah stood solitary against monarchs and the prophets of false deities. They all passed through the crucible of solitude, yet not a single one of them walked it by themselves, and neither will you. You are not forsaken, you are being refined. You are not overlooked, you are being prepared. God is performing a work within you that no person can yet perceive. That is why you must not surrender. Do not curse the quiet, do not flee from the stillness, remain in it, for something holy is unfolding. When the world leaves you in its wake, when companions fall away, when those you love fail to understand, and when you stand at the very brink of your own endurance and declare, God, I cannot take another step, that is precisely when heaven responds with might. That is when a strength surges that is not your own. That is when peace arrives in the midst of the tempest, not because the billows cease, but because you have finally recognized the one who walks on water. Faith is forged not in ease, but in contradiction. It's when every circumstance screams you are alone, yet you decide to believe you are held. It's when everything indicates you are finished, yet you perceive the quiet, small voice whisper, I am not done with you yet. That is faith. That is fire-tested conviction, and it is unshakable. God has always been in the practice of appearing when all other possibilities are exhausted. He does not require favorable circumstances. He does not need an audience. He does not wait for what human standards deem perfect timing. He steps into the prison cell, into the den of lions, into the blazing furnace, not after the crisis has passed, but right in the center of it. And he does this time and time again for all who call upon his name. You might be feeling unseen today. Perhaps no one perceives your pain. Maybe they witness your strength, but not your struggle. They see the smile, but not the restless nights. And perhaps, just perhaps, you have started to accept the falsehood that you must bear this weight all by yourself. But I am here to tell you, you do not. You were never intended to. There is one who remains closer than a brother, one who will never leave you nor abandon you, one who is the same yesterday, today, and for all eternity. His eyes are on the sparrow, and his arms are beneath you even at this moment. He sees the hidden conflicts. He sees the fractured places. He sees the tears that no one else observes. And he declares, you are mine. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. There is a type of prayer that emerges only when a person is out of options. It is not polished. It is not elegant. It is raw. It is authentic. It is desperate. It is the cry that ascends from the dust and the cinders, proclaiming, God, if you do not intervene, I will not survive. And that very kind of prayer moves heaven. When you arrive at the end of your own abilities, you reach the beginning of grace. And grace is not some delicate notion. Grace is a power. It elevates you when your knees buckle. It transports you when your own strength is depleted. It envelops you in mercy when you have stumbled once more. Grace is the very hand of God extracting you from the pit, not because you merited it, but because he loves you. If I do not know what valley you are journeying through, I do not know what the silence feels like in your own life, but I know this with certainty: if you have God, you have all that you require. When the world recedes, when people depart, when doors shut, God remains. And not only does he remain, he restores. God does not simply sit with you in your brokenness, he rebuilds you. He does not merely console you in your sorrow, he gives you beauty for ashes. He grants you strength for your weakness. He transforms mourning into dancing. He turns weeping into rejoicing. There is a future awaiting you. There is hope beyond the suffering. There is life after the loss, but you will not discover it by pursuing the validation of people or the fleeting pleasures of this world. You will find it on your knees, alone with the one who formed you in the womb and knows the exact number of hairs on your head, and your hand, and your hands removed, and your hand on your chin. Do not detest this season. Do not hasten the process. Lean into it. Allow it to purify you. Permit it to simplify you. Let it draw you nearer to the only one who can truly satisfy the profound depths of your heart. This world is brimming with noise, opinions, distractions, and falsehoods. But when you are alone with God, that clamor subsides, and what remains is truth. What remains is love. What remains is power. That power will fill you, that love will transform you, and that truth will set you free. There will come a day when you will look back upon this season, not with resentment, but with gratitude. You will say, it was in that solitary place that I learned to truly listen. It was in that shadowy valley that I discovered the light. It was when I had no one else that I finally understood God was all I ever required. And when you ascend from this place, you will carry something indestructible. You will possess a testimony forged in fire. You will speak with authority, not because you read it in a book, but because you have lived it in your very bones. You will carry peace into chaotic spaces. You will bring hope to shattered people. And when they inquire, how did you make it through? You will answer, I had no one but God, and that was more than enough. You are not disqualified. You are not too far gone. You are not beyond mending. In fact, you are precisely where you must be for a miracle to unfold. When an individual has no one but God, they are ready to be used by God. They are no longer dependent on flimsy support systems. They are no longer intoxicated by applause. They are no longer pursuing what can never fulfill. They are standing upon the rock, and that kind of person cannot be shaken. This is not the conclusion of your story. This is the very chapter that alters everything. Remain faithful, stay humble, stay available. God is not finished. He is writing something magnificent, even if at this moment all you can see are fractured lines. Trust the author. He completes what he begins. When a person finds themselves in the depths of solitude, it is easy to feel as though they have been forsaken by the world. The silence of a vacant room, the absence of voices, and the lack of human company can be overpowering. In those instances, loneliness can feel like a curse, a painful recollection of what has been lost, or of relationships that have withered. But what if this exact solitude is not a curse whatsoever? What if it is the hallowed space where God works most powerfully in a person's life? The reality is that solitude is frequently where transformation occurs, where one can hear the voice of God most distinctly, and where their soul can be molded for something greater. It is in the quiet, in the moments of being by oneself, that a person can divest themselves of the world's distractions. The commotion and activity of life often obscure the still, small voice of God. In the clamor of daily existence, we are inundated with opinions, expectations, and ceaseless demands. But when an individual is alone, free from the pressure of appeasing others or reacting to the constant flow of noise, it becomes simpler to listen, to contemplate, and to be still in the presence of God. In solitude, an individual is invited into a more profound relationship with their Creator. There is no one else to impress, no one else to answer to, just the raw, unfiltered connection between the soul and the Almighty. This is the very space where God can commence His work of personal transformation. The diversions that once fogged the mind dissipate, and one begins to see with clarity. Solitude permits a person to face the deepest chambers of their heart, the parts often concealed from the world and even from themselves. It is in the silence that we can truly see our frailties, our fears, our doubts, and our insecurities. But this is not a reason for despair. It is a prospect for growth. For it is in these very moments that God can meet us exactly where we are, not in spite of our weaknesses, but because of them. God does not summon the perfect. He summons the broken, the weary, the ones who have no other place to turn. And in the quiet, He starts to shape us into who we were always destined to become. Furthermore, solitude is not merely a place for self-reflection. It is also a place of revelation. It is in the stillness that we can hear God's voice more clearly than ever before. His words can slice through the noise of our existence and penetrate our hearts with truth, wisdom, and direction. When the distractions vanish, God's voice emerges as the most prominent sound in our lives. It is in solitude that we can genuinely surrender our plans, our ambitions, and our desires to Him. We cease trying to manage every facet of our lives and instead open ourselves to His guidance. In that instant of surrender, the transformation commences. In solitude, we are not deserted. We are being readied. God utilizes this time to refine us, to instruct us, and to fortify us for the path that lies ahead. While it may feel uneasy, even agonizing, it is in these periods of isolation that we develop into who we were always intended to be. God works through our solitude to pull us closer to Himself and to assist us in becoming more like Him. Solitude is not a place of emptiness. It is a space where the fullness of God's presence can fill us, renew us, and remake us from the inside out. Throughout history, many of the most exceptional individuals were not propelled into greatness by fame, fortune, or public acclaim, but rather by seasons of solitude and trial. It is in the wilderness, far from the limelight, that God frequently does His most profound work in a person's life. When Moses escaped to the wilderness, when David was tending his flock, when Jesus retreated to the desert, they were not being forsaken, they were being prepared. The wilderness is not the conclusion of the story. It is often the very place where God commences to shape us for the task ahead. The wilderness, by its very nature, is a place of isolation and difficulty. It is a place where the comforts of the world are stripped away, leaving an individual with only what is truly essential. In the wilderness, there are no diversions, no applause, and no external validation. It is simply a person and their Creator. It is in this serene, challenging setting that God operates in ways we cannot always comprehend in the moment. A deep transformation occurs in the wilderness, one that readies a person not merely for success, but for a life filled with purpose. Consider Moses. Before he could lead a nation, he spent 4 decades in the wilderness, an exile, a fugitive fleeing from his past errors. But in that wilderness, he learned humility, patience, and a reliance on God. He encountered the voice of God in a burning bush, and it was at that instant he understood his life was part of something far larger than himself. Had he remained in Egypt, encircled by power and influence, he might never have absorbed the lessons the wilderness imparted. The wilderness was not a punishment for Moses. It was the sacred ground where God equipped him for a divine mission that would alter the course of history. David too was anointed to be king, but he did not immediately take the throne. Instead, he spent years fleeing from King Saul, concealing himself in caves and living as a fugitive. It was during these wilderness years that David cultivated strength, character, and trust in God. He learned to guide people not through military power, but through humility and dependence on the Lord. He composed many of the Psalms during this period, expressions of raw feeling, faith, and closeness with God. Had he ascended to the throne without these crucial formative years, he might not have been ready to lead with the wisdom and grace that defined his reign. The wilderness is not just a geographical location, it is frequently a spiritual state that many of us encounter in our lives. There are times when we find ourselves in seasons of hardship, loss, or transition. During these periods, it can feel as if we are distant from God's presence, far from His purpose for our lives. But the reality is, these wilderness seasons are often the very places for God is readying us for something more significant. They are not cul-de-sacs. They are launching pads for what is to come. Just as God summoned Moses and David out of the wilderness at the designated time, He will also lead us out of our wilderness seasons when the moment is right. However, the preparation that takes place in the wilderness should not be undervalued. It is in the wilderness that we learn to depend entirely on God, where we are tested and purified, and where we uncover a strength we never knew we possessed. The wilderness season may be arduous, but it is in these moments of trial and isolation that we are molded into the individuals God requires us to be to fulfill His purposes. It is in the wilderness that we learn to trust. We learn that God is dependable even when we cannot see the path forward. We learn that His provision is sufficient even when our own resources seem scarce. We learn to hear His voice distinctly in the stillness of the desert, away from the clamor of the world, and it is here that we find a deeper intimacy with God, a relationship founded on trust and reliance rather than on the acclaim of the crowd or the validation of others. The wilderness is not a place to flee from, it is a place to embrace. It is where God shapes us, refines us, and prepares us for the journey ahead. So, when you find yourself in a season of solitude, struggle, or confusion, remember this: you are not forgotten, you are being prepared. The wilderness might be uncomfortable, but it is not the conclusion. It is the very place where God is equipping you for something far greater than you can envision. In the depths of despair, when the weight of the world feels too heavy to carry and the will to keep going seems to fade, it is in these moments of vulnerability that God's strength is most profoundly disclosed. For many, weakness is something to be shunned or concealed, a mark of failure or insufficiency. But in the eyes of God, it is not a frailty to be ashamed of. It is the very ground where His strength can be most fully showcased. It is in the moments when a person feels they cannot continue, when they are stripped of their own ability and power, that they encounter a strength beyond their own. In these seasons, we are brought face to face with our own limitations, with a stark reality that there are situations in life we cannot manage, people we cannot alter, and outcomes we cannot dictate. It is in these moments of utter helplessness that God's strength becomes most apparent. His power, working through our weakness, is the most beautiful and transformative force in existence. Paul, one of the foremost apostles of the early church, spoke of this deep truth when he detailed his own struggles and hardships. He pleaded 3 times for God to remove a thorn in the flesh that afflicted him. But God's reply was not to remove the suffering, but to declare, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul's response to this divine insight was profound. "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." In that place of vulnerability, Paul was able to experience the sufficiency of God's grace and the depth of his power. This concept appears counterintuitive to the world's perception of strength. In society, we are instructed to rely on our own abilities, to push through adversity with sheer determination, and to conquer challenges through personal fortitude. But God calls us to a different mindset. He invites us to surrender our self-reliance and to place our trust in His power. He demonstrates that true strength is not about what we can achieve in our own might, but about what He can accomplish through us when we are willing to concede our need for Him. When we are at our lowest point, when we feel utterly powerless, we are frequently more receptive to God's work in our lives. It is then that we cease depending on our own ingenuity, wisdom, or resources and begin to lean completely on Him. In our weakness, we create space for God's power to radiate. His strength does not arrive in the manner we expect. It is not a human type of strength, defined by physical might or self-sufficiency. It is a divine strength, a power that is gentle yet unyielding, a power that grants us the courage to stand when we want to collapse, the wisdom to know the way when we are confused, and the peace to persevere when we feel overwhelmed. God's strength does not nullify our weakness. It is made perfect through it. It is as if God takes our fragility and by His grace transforms it into something beautiful and potent. In moments of despair, when we are broken and exhausted, God meets us with the power to rise once more. His strength sustains us when we cannot sustain ourselves. His strength carries us when our legs fail. His strength lifts us when we are too fatigued to continue. The beauty of this divine strength is that it changes us. We emerge from the trials, the times of weakness, stronger than we were before, not because we accomplished it in our own power, but because we permitted God to work through us. When we acknowledge our dependence on Him, we open ourselves to His transformative might. We emerge from weakness not as the same individual, but as someone who has been shaped, refined, and empowered by God Himself. The truth is, God's strength is not granted to us in the absence of weakness, but in the very midst of it. It is when we are weak that we are most capable of experiencing His strength in its purest form. When we feel we have nothing left, that is when He can fill us with everything we need. In that moment of divine exchange, we come to understand that the very thing we thought would defeat us, the trial, the struggle, the weakness, has become the place where we encounter the fullness of God's power and grace. So if you find yourself in a season of vulnerability, do not despair. Do not believe the lie that you are insufficient or that you are failing. In fact, it is precisely in this place that God is poised to do His greatest work. His strength is made perfect in your weakness. And if you will trust Him in this season, you will emerge stronger, more dependent on Him, and more conscious of the power that only He can supply. There are moments in life when we call out to God and feel as if our prayers go unheard. In these times of quiet, it can be challenging to see beyond the stillness and sense the presence of God. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that God has forsaken us, or that He is somehow remote, detached, or unconcerned with our struggles. But the truth is that God's silence is not an indication of his absence. In fact, it is frequently in these moments of quiet that God is working more powerfully than we can possibly understand. We exist in a world that prizes instant answers and rapid solutions. We are accustomed to immediate results, whether in our careers, relationships, or even our technology. But God's ways are not our ways, and his timing is not constrained by the pressures of the world around us. At times, the silence we perceive from God is not a withdrawal, but a sacred pause, a space where God is permitting us to grow, to trust, and to ready ourselves for what he is about to do. Throughout Scripture, we see numerous examples of God's silence during pivotal moments in his people's journeys. The Israelites waited in Egypt for hundreds of years crying out for deliverance, but God did not respond immediately. There were times in the wilderness when they questioned if God had forgotten them as they confronted hunger, thirst, and immense fear. Yet, God was with them the entire time, orchestrating their liberation in his own timing. His silence was not a mark of abandonment, but a sign of preparation, as he was molding them for the promised land. Even Jesus, the Son of God, experienced the silence of his Father. In the Garden of Gethsemane, as he prayed in agony, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In his moment of deepest suffering, it appeared as though God had turned his face away. Yet in that silence, God was not absent. He was fulfilling his ultimate plan of redemption through Jesus' suffering. God's silence on the cross did not signify abandonment, but rather the unfolding of his perfect will for salvation. God's silence serves as a potent reminder that we are not in control. In our human nature, we frequently demand immediate answers, quick remedies, and a clear path forward. But God's silence instructs us in patience, faith, and trust in his timing. It is in the waiting, in the moments when we feel like nothing is occurring, that God is often doing his most significant work. He is preparing us, strengthening us, and aligning our hearts with his will. In the quiet, God is cultivating a deeper faith and a greater dependence on his plan, which is always far more magnificent than anything we could have arranged ourselves. The silence is also a trial of our trust. When God is silent, we are confronted with a choice. Will we persist in believing in his goodness even when we do not hear his voice? Will we stay faithful when it feels like he is distant? This is a critical point in our spiritual journey. God's silence invites us to trust not in what we can perceive with our senses, but in what we know of his character. We know that he is good, that he is faithful, and that he loves us. And even when we cannot feel his presence, we can rest assured that he is still with us, working behind the scenes to bring about his flawless plan. The delays and periods of silence in our lives are not indicators of rejection or abandonment. They are a component of the divine process, shaping us for the purposes God has for us. While we may not comprehend the silence in the moment, we can trust that God's timing is always perfect. When he finally does speak, it will be at precisely the right moment, and his plan will unfold in ways we could never have foreseen. So when you find yourself in a season of quiet, do not be disheartened. Know that God is not absent. He is present, working in unseen ways, preparing you for the next stage of your journey. His silence is not a sign of neglect, but a sign of his perfect timing and care. Trust in his process and wait in faith, knowing that his plan will always be worth the wait. There comes a time in every person's life when we reach the end of ourselves. We find ourselves standing at the precipice, exhausted, worn down, and feeling as though we have nothing left to offer. The struggles, the disappointments, the heartaches, and the failures accumulate, and we can no longer bear the weight by ourselves. In these moments, we might feel lost, as if we have reached the very limit of our strength and endurance. But it is precisely in these moments of total surrender, when we come to the end of our own capacity, that we encounter the grace of God. God's grace is not a delicate thing. It is not a mere consolation or a fleeting comfort. His grace is powerful, unshakable, and immeasurably deep. It is in our moments of weakness, when we feel the most broken and vulnerable, that His grace arrives to lift us up. God's grace does not just soothe us in our pain, it fortifies us. It gives us the power to rise again when we are too tired to stand, to press forward when we are certain we cannot take another step, and to persevere when we feel as if we have reached our breaking point. The Apostle Paul, one of the most prominent figures in early Christianity, understood the sufficiency of God's grace better than most. Paul faced numerous trials, persecutions, and hardships throughout his life. In Corinthians 12:9, he writes about a personal struggle he faced, referring to a thorn in the flesh that tormented him. He prayed earnestly, asking God 3 times to remove this burden from his life. Yet, instead of delivering him from the pain, God answered with these powerful words, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul's response to this revelation was profound. "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." What Paul understood in that moment was that God's grace was not only enough to sustain him through his trials, but it was also the very thing that empowered him to continue. It was in his weakness that God's strength was revealed most brightly. His grace became the source of Paul's strength and endurance, even in the midst of his greatest struggles. This is the very nature of God's grace. It is not a temporary remedy or a passing comfort, but a deep and steadfast foundation. When we feel like we have given all that we have, when we feel we are on the verge of collapsing under the weight of life's burdens, God's grace intervenes and holds us up. It becomes the support we lean on when our own strength gives way. It is in our most vulnerable moments that God's grace extends to us, reminding us that we do not have to carry the weight of the world by ourselves. God's grace is not earned or merited. It is freely given. There is nothing we can do to make ourselves worthy of it. And yet, in our most desperate times, it is offered to us in abundance. It is in this grace that we discover the strength to keep moving forward, to continue in the face of adversity, and to endure when the path ahead seems impassable. God's grace is sufficient to meet us exactly where we are and to elevate us to where He wants us to be. It is in our weakness that we come to genuinely comprehend the depth of God's grace. When we are at the end of our own resources, we finally recognize that we cannot do it on our own. We cannot control everything, we cannot fix everything, and we cannot carry every burden. But it is in that very act of surrender and admitting that we are not enough that God's grace flows in and empowers us. We are not designed to rely on our own strength, but on the strength that God supplies. And when we rely on His grace, we find that it is more than enough to carry us through. God's grace doesn't just transport us, it transforms us. It is not only a source of strength, but also a source of healing. It mends the broken places in our hearts, restores what has been lost, and revitalizes our spirits. It is in grace that we find the courage to forgive, the resilience to hope again, and the peace that surpasses all understanding. There may be times when we feel utterly depleted, when we feel as though we have nothing left to give. But even in those times, God's grace is not exhausted. It is infinite. It is sufficient for every trial, every challenge, and every heartache. When we come to the end of our own abilities, it is only then that we are able to fully experience the power and sufficiency of God's grace. And in that grace, we find the strength to stand again, to press onward, and to continue walking in His purpose for our lives. So when you feel that you are at your weakest, when you feel like you cannot go on any longer, remember this: God's grace is enough. It is powerful, it is sustaining, and it will never be depleted. You are never alone, and His grace will always be sufficient to carry you through. In the darkest moments of life, when isolation and struggle weigh heavily upon our hearts, it is easy to feel as though we are lost or forgotten. The road ahead may seem obscure, and the burdens we carry can feel impossible to bear. But in these very moments of uncertainty, a profound truth emerges. It is faith and hope that become our anchors, keeping us grounded and propelling us forward even when everything around us seems uncertain. Faith and hope in God are not merely fleeting emotions. They are the lifelines that sustain us through the most challenging seasons of our lives. They serve as reminders that God's plan is perpetually at work, even when we cannot perceive it, and that He is preparing us for something greater. Faith is the foundation upon which we construct our trust in God. It is the conviction that even when circumstances appear bleak, God remains good and His promises hold true. Faith does not demand that we possess all the answers or see the entire picture. In fact, it often calls for us to step forward in trust when we have no idea what lies ahead. Faith is the choice to cling to God's character, even in the absence of clear guidance. It is the confidence that although storms may rage around us, God is still in control, and His purpose for our lives remains unchanged. Hope is the fruit of that faith. Hope is what keeps us moving when all we possess is a glimpse of God's promises, a faint whisper of the goodness He has in store. It is the assurance that no matter how arduous the journey may become, we are not alone. Hope provides us with the strength to endure, to press onward, and to hold fast to the belief that our current circumstances do not dictate our future. Hope tells us that there is more awaiting us, that God's ultimate plan for our lives is far greater than any single moment of suffering or trial. The Bible reminds us of the power of faith and hope in Romans 8:24-25. For in this hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. This passage beautifully encapsulates the essence of having faith and hope in God. We do not always see the complete picture, but we trust in His promise that He is working behind the scenes. It is this hope that assists us in navigating the difficult seasons of our lives, knowing that God has a plan, even if we do not yet comprehend it. And when we place our faith in God and hold on to hope, we are not only sustained through difficult times, but we are also being prepared for the greater purpose He has for our lives. Struggles and challenges are not arbitrary. They are the refining process that molds us into the people God needs us to be for the next chapter of our journey. The trials we confront serve a purpose. Even when we cannot immediately see it, they prepare us to rise again, stronger and better equipped to fulfill the purpose that God has set before us. Consider, for instance, the story of Joseph. His life was marked by betrayal, abandonment, and hardship. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, unjustly thrown into prison, And left alone in dark moments, Joseph had every reason to lose hope. Yet, through it all, Joseph never relinquished his faith in God. He trusted that God had a plan for his life, even when it seemed as though everything was collapsing. In the end, Joseph rose to a position of great authority where he was able to save innumerable lives during a time of famine. His faith and hope in God, even in the midst of suffering, not only sustained him, but also prepared him to fulfill his divine purpose. Similarly, the Apostle Paul, who faced persecution, imprisonment, and relentless hardship, continued to press on in faith, always hopeful in the promises of God. Despite the pain, he knew that the trials he endured were not pointless. In Romans 5:3-4, Paul writes, "Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." This is a powerful reminder that every trial we encounter is an opportunity for growth. Our faith and hope are refined through adversity, making us more resilient, more compassionate, and more capable of fulfilling the purpose God has for us. When we hold on to faith and hope, we are being equipped for the future. The trials we endure today might seem like setbacks, but in reality, they are the very experiences that prepare us for the greater purpose God has established for us. Our struggles do not define us, but they do shape us. They teach us perseverance, humility, and trust. They refine our character and increase our capacity to love and serve others. Through it all, we can rest in the knowledge that God is utilizing every moment of our lives, every hardship, every trial, and every joy to prepare us for the unique purpose He has for us. Faith and hope are the instruments that help us navigate the journey, even when the path is obscure. They remind us that God is with us, that He is working all things together for our good, and that His timing is perfect. We may not always understand the reasons for our struggles, but we can trust that God is guiding us towards something greater. So in those moments when you feel isolated, when the weight of the world seems too much to bear, hold on to faith and hope. Trust that God is at work behind the scenes, even when you cannot see it. Keep moving forward, knowing that He is preparing you for a greater purpose, a purpose that will be revealed in His perfect timing. And when the time comes for you to rise again, you will discover that you are stronger, wiser, and better equipped to fulfill the calling God has placed on your life.